Hello, everyone, and welcome to the summer session of APPA. We're so happy for your interest in this topic area, and we hope you enjoy this presentation. My name is Lori Brisbane, and I'm with the National Institute of Corrections, and I have a special interest in this area of staff trauma and support, programs that help our staff stay strong. I also work on a variety of other topic areas, and I do manage the Probation and Parole Executives Network, which some of you probably belong to. If you're not familiar with NIC, I would highly encourage you to take a look at our website. That web address is nicic.gov. We have all kinds of free training and information and support on that website because we are a federal agency. Everything we do is at no cost to you or your agency. So please take a look at that website. Again, it's nicic.gov. So if I could just tell you briefly a little bit about this journey. In October of 2019, NIC conducted a survey of the field to determine what agencies were most concerned about, what their priorities were. One of the categories that received a high ranking was staff recruitment, development, coaching, retention, and health and wellness. NIC listened to those concerns and has been adding to our resources around staff wellness and responses to staff trauma. And why is this so important? Stronger, more resilient staff, better retention rates, and staff feel supported. Why is that important? Because in some recent research that was done, what we learned is that the one complaint that staff have above all others is that management does not care about them. Then how do you express that care? By actually learning a way to reach out to them and make sure that they are cared for. So that is really why we have the interest in this work. In working to identify evidence-based and promising practices around this issue, we embarked on an ongoing project to develop recommendations for programs that address both short-term and long-term staff trauma, as well as other strategies and interventions. The presentation you will be hearing today outlines the first major step in this project, an assessment of the current climate regarding staff trauma response and support programs and community supervision. I'm so pleased to introduce Tara Kunkel and Christina Bryant, who will be discussing their work on the project and the information gathered so far. NIC would like to thank you for your interest in this topic, and I invite you to contact me directly if you have any questions or would like to contribute additional material to this project. My email is lbrisbane, that's LBRISBIN @bop.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Welcome to all of our attendees. I am Tara Kunkel. I am the Executive Director of Rulo Strategies. My passion for this topic really dates back to my very second job in my entire career. I was a local probation officer in Virginia. And I think often of the experiences that I had during that point in my life. I think about the first time a client overdosed. I think about the experiences around threats of violence. I think about the stories that I heard and how they weighed on me. I thought about the caseloads and balancing very heavy caseloads and all that impacted me and how that impacted my colleagues. And so this work is personal to me because of that. I also have a professional interest in it. I have worked in a number of departments all over the United States doing assessments and evaluations of various programs and seeing firsthand the way that vicarious trauma and stress in the workplace can impact outcomes, retention, and how departments function. So I'm really excited to share with you some of our work today. But before I do that, I want to turn things over to Christina Bryant.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am very similar to Tara in that I have a personal interest in this that rises from coming through the ranks in probation starting out in juvenile probation, moving on to adult probation, and then ultimately in a leadership executive role that allowed me to put a lot of time into thinking about staff wellness, the care of staff, how we were taking care of them, and how that affected our outcomes when it came to things like retention and turnover and the wellness of our staff. So this work is really feeding into that. We are excited to share with you today, and I get to start our presentation. So Lori gave you a little bit of background already, but just to center us again, Rulo Strategies and the National Center for State Courts did receive an award from NIC to complete a cooperative agreement. And that agreement was really centered around doing this deep dive, or doing this initial dive into what is going on in the world in supervision specifically. They really did narrow in and separate out community supervision versus supervision or correctional officers in the larger realm. I would note, just for anyone who may be listening to us, there are about 4.5 million people on supervision. That's twice the amount of people that are in correctional centers. Our job is grand. It's great. It affects a lot of people. So when Tara and I started this work, our major deliverable in year one was a white paper. That white paper, we broke down into several pieces. One being looking at the available research. We wanted to do that at a national and international level. We wanted to do that directly on point for our community supervision colleagues, but we also looked at some of the disciplines that surround us or that are similar. We have done interviews. We are doing or have done a needs assessment, which is what we're here today to talk to you about. And then our last step is going to be focus groups. And you may be wondering, why? Why is this important? Well, you're here, so you obviously recognize some value. And if you are an officer or someone who's working in the front line, I would say this is important to you because of your longevity of career. You are aware of, should be concerned about your own healthy lifestyle choices, which your career and your job affects. These things affect your day-to-day work. They affect your home life as well. So we want to make sure that we are doing work and engaging in an area that is making your work easier and your lifestyle and career a safer, healthier place. If you are joining us from a management or leadership perspective, we want you to start thinking about organizational cost. There's huge cost in turnover, in training when there's turnover. I recently saw some numbers that said the average turnover rate in our industry is between 17 to 31%, which is a huge spread and may be representative of agencies that are doing this well and agencies not well. Obviously, a lot of factors may be driving that, but that's 17 to 31 is high, particularly when you look at the average from an HR perspective, is somewhere between 12 and 20 is what you're looking for, probably closer to 12. And we're not even coming close to that when we're talking about the low end for our industry. If you think about from a management perspective, officers taking time off and being away from the office because of sickness or illness, whether that is their physical health or mental health. There's a higher use of insurance, which sends up our insurance premiums. And there's also just the general care and concern that we should have for our officers, for the individuals who are working in this industry. We have an obligation to them. So just let's start a little bit at the beginning and start talking about data. What is out there? Well, in quick summary, not a lot. When it comes to our actual profession of supervision officers in the community, we do know, here's a good comparison. We do know that there is quite a bit of information out there around clients in trauma. We've done a lot of work in that area. We have assessments, we have interventions, we have thought about how we're interacting with them. We have thought about the courtroom settings for them, but we haven't really stepped back and done enough work yet in the area of staff, probation officers, community supervision officers, and trauma. If you think about what we're talking about today, think about it in two areas. One is that direct primary stress, and then the second area is the indirect secondary stress. So thinking about that direct primary stress, how would we define that? We would define that as having violent offenders on our caseloads, and those interactions that we're having with people who we already know are at high risk and to react in those ways. Talking about sex offenders that are on our caseloads and the trauma that comes along with working with sex offenders, the victimization, the work you have to address to effectively supervise them. As Tara mentioned earlier, just those direct threats to staff. That is something that we have to, sometimes we'll have to manage within our lives or within our work. Home visits. When we do home visits, sometimes we don't feel safe. We're not in the safest environment. Those are all primary or direct stressors. The death of a client. That's a huge one, and one that we're seeing more and more, whether it's by an overdose, suicide, homicide. Those things affect us, absolutely. Lastly, we would note that there is a stress for officers, and that we know, particularly those who are caring and have concern for the clients they're working with in the community we're serving, we know that the decisions we're making stand to have longer term impacts. And those impacts at times can be large. They can be in response to a drunk driving incident, one that ultimately has victims or fatal injuries at the end of it. Or having an offender on supervision who we made decisions around how we were going to handle a violation, or if we were going to return them to court, only for them to go out and commit additional violent crimes and create more victims. Most officers, that weighs on them. That decision and the responsibility associated with that decision weighs on them. In addition, those decisions sometimes play out in public opinion, and we're aware that that's a possibility. All of those things begin to kind of tighten down the screws when we're talking about stress. The secondary and indirect stress. Probation officers are often exposed to the trauma histories of the clients that we're serving or that we're working with. Many of them are women with sexual abuse in their background. Many of them are domestic violence who abuse and that power and control is a big part of their day-to-day. We're delivering cognitive behavioral groups. That is something that in the last 20 years has continued to grow and grow and grow. And we are doing a great job of working through how to provide that skill or how to provide those environments for clients. We're doing a great job of teaching our officers how to do those, facilitate those groups, but are we doing the same good job of helping the officers work through what that may be causing for them? If we don't address these things, it begins to lead to burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary traumatization. What I would say to you that's not on the slide today is that sounds like a sick environment, not necessarily a toxic environment because it's not purposeful, but one that is unhealthy. And that's what we're hoping to work on and improve through some of the work we're doing here. So diving just a little bit further on the cognitive behavioral groups, because this really gives us a great example to share. The needs assessment we did, which you're going to hear a whole lot more about here shortly, let us know that more than 50% of the people who responded were engaging in some kind of group facilitated. So MRT, thinking for change, seeking safety, that kind of thing. But of that, 67% said to us that it was facilitating those groups that were sources of stress for them. 58% of them noted that they would attribute some of the primary and secondary stressors to the work they were doing in those cognitive behavioral groups. That seems pretty reasonable when we think about clinicians and we think about clinicians who are running groups, and then if we go on and think about how do we make sure the clinicians stay healthy, clinicians have clinical supervision. So you see there in those orange boxes the statements of formal supervision is one of the primary methods of reducing the impact of secondary traumatization on group facilitators, and research suggests that supervision should be both mandatory and regularly provided. That sounds in line when we're talking about clinicians and the work that clinicians do. Have we ever considered, though, is that an expectation when we're talking about officers who are delivering similar processes, similar groups, similar services? This really represents that changing in role that we hear and that we've been living for a while now, that role back and forth between accountability or the other end of the role being that we're responsible for affecting behavior change. We're responsible for moving probationers from that external law enforcement, you do it because we said you do it, to the more intrinsic internal motivation. And this next slide gives us a little bit of a visual of that. So that role ambiguity, the role conflict, role overload leads to more work stress. So we're talking about those screws getting a little tighter and tighter when we're talking about the causes of stress for us. The organizational factors there, the role overload, excessive paperwork, unreasonable time restraints, and high caseloads, those all lead to the compassion fatigue, the burnout that we have been talking about. One other area that kind of stands out in the data is that there is work being done, or there has been some studies around caseloads that are specific. So if you think about in that first box, references 62% of those who work in the management of people with sex offenses, they're having 62% of them are acknowledging that that is causing for them intrusions into their life. So intrusions in the area of flashbacks, intrusive images. They're more likely to experience depression and isolation. The middle box talks about just generally officers who report violent and sexual recidivism on their caseloads, supervisees who commit suicide, and threats of assault in the line of duty. Those of us who've experienced that, we experience a much higher measure and have a much higher measure of traumatic stress and burnout in officers. Totally makes sense. I bet that is not rocket science, but what are we doing about it? We know it, but what are we doing about it? Third box talks about a study in 2008 done on those doing domestic violence supervision, and it found that female community supervision officers, unlike their male counterparts, report an increased awareness of power and control issues at all levels in their own lives. So we're taking it home. It's affecting how we're working and how we're thinking. But let's flip the switch. You know, we've been talking about the screws, kind of just screwing it down on you, maybe feeling a little tighter just in general listening to us talk. But there is some work to help mitigate that. And it really starts with resiliency. So as I go through the next couple of slides talking about resiliency, I want you to think about your colleagues, think about who's in your office when we describe resiliency, think about your organization. If you are a leader, think about that organization and what you have control over and what you can contribute as we talk about resiliency. Consider who you have hired and what you can do and who you're going to hire. So resiliency appears to stem from a mix of internal attributes and external supports. It is a self-belief of self-efficacy. So those people who believe I can do this, they see the glass as half full. They have good social skills. They have good problem-solving skills. They have good emotional regulation, and they're optimistic. All important attributes. If you're thinking about those colleagues, you're thinking about your office, and you're feeling like maybe we're falling a little short, that's okay. Resiliency can be trained. It can be trained at that personal developmental level with staff. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. It can be trained and we can affect it at the organizational level. What we want to do is we want to reduce the isolation. We want to increase the positive social networks. We want to invest in the people who work for us. We want to invest in our colleagues. We want to provide an environment where resiliency is something that we uphold and something that we are training towards. Organizational resiliency is really, from this perspective, we think about our whole agency as a whole. We're thinking about the policies that are in place, the training, the leadership, the culture, the social support. We have an opportunity to make an impact here. The research tells us this is something that will impact the bottom line. So when you think about training, think about how we prepare officers for their role. When you think about policies, think about what policies are in place and how supportive are they of the work that's being done. Do your policies reflect that you value the officers that work for you, the training that they have? From a leadership perspective, do you value the relationships that are there from profession to profession, from colleague to colleague? Do you have things in place that kind of support those? The culture of the organization, is it open in communication? Is there mutual support? Their social support, is the organization supportive of coworkers and peers? Now, as we move into the actual assessment and sharing that information with you, we can just quickly remind you that this was one of 4 steps that we're taking. In those steps, this needs assessment was done back in April and May. It wasn't too extensive. We were not looking to answer every question. We just kind of wanted to scan the front line. And we were looking to gather information back from agency staff, from supervisors, from the probation executives, the leadership in community supervision agencies, but also from the training academies. We tried to reach out to training academies to see how these kind of materials were already built in. We had 143 responses, and of those responses, we heard back from about 30% of middle management, about 30% of agency directives, a little bit higher than 20% of our frontline officers, almost 13% of the administrative support staff, and then training, which ended up being a very small piece, and an other. There were 21 states ultimately represented in the work in the surveys that we received back. So geographically, pretty well represented. And the age range came from 40 years and older at 66%, 25 to 39 at 32, and then a very small percentage under 25. And I would suggest to you with that 66% 40 and older that we were likely getting a population of employees who had been in the business for a while. Tara, I'm going to turn it over to you to start giving us that content.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm really excited to share this information with you. This is the first audience in which we are talking about our findings. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide and talk to you about what the question was that was asked of the respondents, and also what they had to say about each of the disciplines represented here. So there was a set of 3 questions that everybody was asked. The question was, how important is employee wellness to your leadership? How important is it to your middle managers or supervisors? And then how important is it to your line officers? And so what we see here is that there are some slight differences among those 3 groups in terms of how it's rated as a high priority. So all of the respondents reported that leadership at 38.5% considered it a high priority. For line officers, about 37.1%, and then the dip there for middle managers and supervisors in terms of it being rated as a high priority for that subgroup. If you are looking at this slide and you are in a leadership position and you want to ensure that your staff rate you as considering employee wellness a high priority, we actually asked the respondents to tell us, how might you do that? How would you know that it was a high priority for your leadership? And here's what they had to say. So first, it was a part of the culture because it was consistently communicated. It was communicated and discussed in emails from leadership. It was a part of the agenda in staff meetings. It was part of the strategic plan. And for some people, I know strategic plans are something we write and we put them on a shelf. But I think within this group, if you really stay true and adhere to your strategic plan, having it called out in your strategic plan is a meaningful way as a leader to signal that it is important to you. Others pointed out that there are individuals within their organization that leadership has designated as having employee wellness as part of the job description. So that is another way that leadership can really communicate. And then I think the other thing that respondents said is when they are clear that leadership understands that this is a vulnerable area for employees. So when you're talking in your email communications, when you're talking in your staff meetings about these topics, you are telegraphing and communicating very clearly that this is something that any one of the individuals in the room, including yourself as leadership, can struggle with, and you're just norming this as part of the culture. So that's what leadership can do to bump up their scores. So then we asked, what can middle managers and supervisors do to convey and telegraph to the agency that employee wellness is a priority? First and foremost, making it a part of your regular meetings with your supervisees. So if you're having weekly, bi-weekly check-ins, monthly check-ins with your staff, have it as an agenda item. It makes it a normal part of the conversation. It doesn't make it an exception. It doesn't attach stigma to it. It places it as just a core piece of what we do to take care of ourselves. Second thing, making sure you show up to trainings that are offered on this topic. If there are workshops, opportunities to work on a particular area around wellness, seeing you present makes it a part of the culture and norms that taking care of yourself is a priority. So I think those, and then again, just being kind of comfortable. And then some suggested that it actually is a part of the yearly goals within their organization to take proactive training to take care of your wellness and demonstrate that you're doing that. For some agencies, the respondents said that's actually become part of what they are evaluated on. And then finally, we asked, how do you know that employee wellness is a priority for line officers? And so what they had to say is that people were taking advantage of the educational opportunities being offered around this topic. They were taking leave. Having an organization that values taking care of yourself and taking leave and norming, again, that's part of how we all renew ourselves and take care of ourselves, that's important. There were spaces being created to have dialogues between peers about how you're taking care of yourself, how the stress is impacting you. So if you want to see yourself move over more to the high priority on this scale over time, those are some tips based on what the survey respondents had to say about making those shifts. So in the needs assessment, we explored 4 common areas that agencies take on to address stress, vicarious trauma, critical incidents. So we explored, and there were sections of the survey looking at each of these areas. So I want to walk through what the respondents had to say about each one. So first, we asked about employee assistance programs, and we acknowledge that the respondents come from a variety of structures. Some are embedded within a county structure in which there's a kind of a formalized program that sits outside of the agency that's kind of distant. It's more like something you refer to, but there's no meaningful connection. And then other respondents are working in an environment where maybe there is the potential to strengthen the partnership with that agency. There's an opportunity to communicate more directly the agency needs and build up programming in that fashion. So you may or may not represent or see yourself in this data, but we asked them, do you have an employee assistance program, and how much is it a part of your agency's culture? So nearly 60% said they have one, and it is a part of the agency culture. 31% said, we have it, but it really could be more fully developed. And then here we see on the lower end of the spectrum, it exists in name only, 3%. No one really, uses it. 3% say it doesn't, they don't have it, and they would like it. And then 4% said we don't have it, and there really aren't any plans to develop one within our agency. So we asked them, how much is the EAP integrated in the workplace? And it does appear limited. Mostly it's handing out a referral. Here's a phone number, here's the website of the EAP. You can contact them, but not really a well-integrated thing. And I think that's in part this idea that I think we've heard a lot, which is that EAPs may not, if they're operating kind of as a general HR function for a broader subset of government, they may not entirely understand the culture of what it means to work in community supervision, what the day in and day out life is like for an officer, and what the specific and unique dimensions of what stress, vicarious trauma may look like for them. And there's not a lot of cross training. Now, the good news is 17% of you did have some level of cross training, but 83% did not. So I think those are some takeaways in terms of employee assistance programs. Probably the least utilized, kind of least important of the 4 areas we're going to kind of talk about, but that doesn't mean that there's not room for improvement. I would suggest to you, just because it maybe isn't part of your culture right now, or that it is somewhat of a distant entity, doesn't mean that you couldn't begin some dialogue with them and consider if there's a willingness or an interest to come and shadow within your agency for a week or so? Would there be a willingness for some of the staff to do that so they can, again, begin to understand the unique dimensions of what the work of being a community supervision officer is? It may be interesting to see if there is kind of an interest. It's perhaps they've never considered that would be an opportunity for them. They may be really excited about that invitation, or it may not be possible. But I think it's exciting to think about what potential there is if there is some willingness to do that. So I want to move on to our second area, critical response teams. And here we see 31% said it exists but could be more fully developed. 28% it exists and it's part of the agency culture. So not a huge uptake in terms of it being like completely a part of what it is your agency does. 14% indicated it's really a name only, not really used. If you looked at an old policy and procedure manual, you might see it, but no one can really remember the last time it was utilized. 9% don't have one, but would really like one, and 18% don't have any real plans to develop one. I'm always curious by that and intrigued. And if we were in a live room, we would have the opportunity to hear more about some of the dimensions of thinking, if any of you all happen to fall into that 18% group. In part, I think critical response teams still are not, in my mind, completely uniformly defined. And so I wonder if there's some ambiguity about how they can be used, should be used. And we'll talk a little bit more about maybe there might even be some kind of funding challenges, training challenges. So we'll see some of that as we go on that maybe are limiting the full adoption of these. So we did ask for those people that do have one that is operating, how formal crisis debriefings are conducted. And again, I think there's probably a range of when formal crisis debriefings occur and what might trigger a formal crisis debriefing. So I want to acknowledge that diversity in the field. So there's not a lot of uniformity around this. But in terms of those that have them, sort of putting or answering this question in the context of how their agency operates, 64.9% said they were conducted both with the individual that experienced the incident, but acknowledging there may be a kind of a broader group impacted. So there may be both individual and group debriefings that occur. And then sort of an exact split of 8.8% did it just with the group, and then 8.8% did it just with the individual. In terms of who was included in that process when it occurs, 86% the people directly involved in the incident, but 38.6% acknowledged that oftentimes these things that occur, whether it's a threat or an actual act of violence towards an officer, some really sort of devastating thing like a suicide among the teams. Sometimes it really only directly impacts the individual, but a lot of times there's people on the periphery who have observed what's happened to their colleague and walk away with concerns that similar thing could happen to them. And so it does seem as if there's some acknowledgement that that's a really important thing. And then 21.1% it's other parties. So in terms of what people had to say, for those that do have an active critical response team, 88% would recommend this model to other supervision agencies. So if you don't have this and you want to learn more about it, I think there's an opportunity to do some kind of peer-to-peer learning there and get a sense of how it might be helpful to your agency. 86% said that it was meeting their needs, but I think it's interesting to really look a little bit under the cover at those that said it did not. And we asked them, when it's not meeting your needs, why is that? And so this is what they had to say. It was usually either about inconsistent deployment. So it was kind of rolled out and then kind of just dropped. It wasn't anybody's job. There was no sort of plan to continue to make it a priority, to have discussions about how it could evolve, to look at how it's effective and not effective. So just that inconsistency is one of the reasons why there is this subgroup that says it's not meeting their needs. The other reasons, there either wasn't training, which I think was often linked to there wasn't funding, and I think this goes back to kind of that very first question we asked, if the culture of your agency isn't about taking care of yourself, these specific interventions kind of fall apart a little bit. If they don't have a sense that like, hey, this whole thing about how I am feeling as an officer and how my colleagues are taken care of, if that's not a part of the culture, then these specific interventions seem kind of like one and done and not as authentic or fully implemented as it could be. And so that is what we took away from the needs assessment about critical response teams. So moving on to employee wellness programs. So 28% it says this exists, it's part of our culture. 33% said this exists, could be more fully developed. And then we sort of fall apart after that. 9% say it exists in name, but really not utilized by the staff. 19% are really interested in this, but they don't have it. And I think that's in part because there's not like an obvious pathway of how to, there's not an off-the-shelf curriculum for that agencies could easily grab and say, this is what we're going to do in the context of a community supervision agency. So I think that might in some ways be why it never kind of kicks off. As well as it takes time, it takes time and effort. And then 11% say they don't have it and there are no plans to develop it. Of those that do have employee wellness programs, 79% said they would recommend this model to other supervision agencies. But I think here's the interesting thing. Only 0.5%, that's not a typo, of respondents report that the employee wellness program within their agency is widely utilized. So they'd recommend it, but it's not widely utilized. And so we did ask, where it's not widely utilized, why is that? What could change here? And so I think what's interesting is either that it's perceived as not useful, and I have a theory about that, or there's stigma around seeking support. And that stigma word comes up a couple times in the needs assessment in what people had to say. And I think that's just an area where as a field, I think we have a lot more work to do to make it okay to take care of ourselves. I do think coming out of the pandemic, we might see an uptick in sort of willingness to talk about stress and the way that things around us impact us. I hope that that's one of the positive things that comes out of the pandemic. But I think it's interesting that that is one of the areas for underutilization. The other things, just looking at some of the other content, they felt like maybe some of the employee wellness programs were coming really from the county level. So this goes back to my theory about why it's not useful, that the programs in place might be coming more from a very broad county-wide perspective that's not targeted to the particular discipline of community supervision. And that makes it feel not useful, like the content isn't specific enough to the experiences of a community supervision officer. We also looked at and asked what dimensions of a person's wellness are being discussed in these programs. When we look at what the offerings are, what the topics are that are being discussed, what do we see? And this does not surprise me. Physical health is, something we kind of see everywhere discussed. And 87% said that's a piece of our employee wellness program. So getting proper sleep, getting exercise, nutrition. I think those are topics that we're all kind of comfortable with. And we do see kind of a heavy leaning towards that topic. But 75% did have some content about managing stress and developing coping skills. And as Chris pointed out earlier, we can teach some skills. There are pieces of resiliency we can teach. And so really kind of building that in is so important. Work-life balance, 70%, and then it starts to kind of dribble off from there. So managing our relationships in and outside of work, financial literacy, developing a support network, which is actually really tied to resiliency. So a very, very important area to hit on. We're maybe not covering that enough in our existing agency wellness programs. And then developing a sense and purpose and meaning in life. And you might wonder, why did we ask about these particular areas? They are the areas in kind of the broader research around wellness that impact kind of, if you think of a whole person in every aspect of wellness, these are the dimensions that the research says are kind of tied to our wellness. So that's why we chose these areas to explore. So we have some areas we're really comfortable talking about, and then some things where maybe we don't have the right trainers, or we're less comfortable with, or there's more stigma around talking about it in the workplace, that maybe we can continue to examine. This is what people had to say. So this is open text answers. So people had a chance to just kind of offer final statements about what would make this particular approach more helpful to them, or they would be more likely to utilize it. So people commented, our program is very focused on physical health and we don't talk as much about mental health, and we really should kind of be more open to talking about those aspects as well. A hunger for more information on financial literacy and work-life balance. The sense that like the things that they go learn in class, they're not being applied in the regular workplace. It's not sort of woven in or sort of discussed. It's like a one and done class that isn't sort of integrated in concrete ways into their daily lives. More secular counseling services were needed, is what was something someone commented about, in this notion of trauma-informed. So we as officers probably have been to training on being trauma-informed officers. Have we been to similar trainings to talk about being trauma-informed workplace? So again, we focus a lot on our skills of interacting with the people that we supervise. We maybe don't think as much about how we interact with one another. And what kind of the culture of our agency as a whole. And again, I think this final comment is a nod to those programs that are kind of more broadly implemented across all government agencies. It's not really tailored specific to the agency where it's being deployed. Finally, in terms of asking about new officer training, so the majority did say that there was some aspect of this new officer training that addresses stress and well-being. Only about a fourth report that this training really goes on to be part of the broader agency culture. So more of, again, this thing we do with new officers, less of an emphasis once we're kind of fully into our work, and maybe when we need it the most. Finally, we're going to talk about peer support program models. This data all starts to look pretty similar. 28% said it exists and is part of the agency culture. 26% said it exists but could be more fully developed. And then 22%, there's an interest, but it doesn't exist. And again, I think that may be in part because there's not an off-the-shelf curriculum that says, our manual or guidelines or best practices that says this is how you should go about starting this program. And I tend to believe that when we make it easy, when we take the best of the research and we make it into a manual and we make implementation easy, we're more likely to do things than when an agency has to go and figure out every piece and part on their own. That's just, can be stressful, takes a lot of time. So the easier we make it to implement these models, the more we summarize the research and make things manualized, the more likely. So I think that's food for additional thought about how we grow our interventions around stress. So those that do have peer support programs, about half say that the members of the peer support team are chosen by nomination. So they either nominate themselves or they're nominated by maybe a supervisor or a peer based on a criteria that the agency has established. Once they're selected in terms of looking at the training they receive, 89% said they do formally train the individuals who are part of their peer support teams. And the most common duration of that training was 1 to 2 days. And there was a mix of using standardized training models out there for training their peers versus kind of creating a homegrown kind of training approach to all of this. And then we also asked, how do you, on an ongoing basis, make sure that the individuals serving in a peer support role are supported? So 51% said that they receive either supervision and or some form of ongoing training that may be kind of an annual refresher or quarterly meetings with those serving in the roles to kind of talk through some issues that are coming up across the agency, or do kind of a briefer training on areas where maybe the skills aren't fully developed yet. So that is kind of how those that have peer support operate. We do know that how peer support is utilized varies across agency. So we did want to explore that a little bit and understand the various dimensions of how this is being deployed. So 53% said they regularly use peer support after a critical incident. So this kind of ties really closely with the critical incident response team that we looked at earlier. 39% though do use it to manage routine stressors that come up. So there's this opportunity at any time just to reach out to someone who's serving in a peer support team to talk about kind of the day-to-day stuff that comes up, which happens more often, right? The critical incidents are the exception, but on a daily or weekly basis, the exposure to things that add up and impact us is much more common. And then 39% were using the peers to also kind of support officer well-being. So they may be the ones that are sometimes the instructors for some of the employee wellness curriculum. They may be the ones putting out the emails that maybe come out monthly that offer tips and tricks on how to support employee wellness. They may be the ones kind of sending out a really cool article that's relevant to the agency. So that is kind of an overview of how different agencies are most commonly using these models. 85% of those that had a peer support program said they would recommend this approach to other agencies. Nearly 79% said that the program meets their needs as an individual employee, but also 77% said that the peer program meets their agency's needs. So it's meeting, broadly the whole agency, but also individual needs. However, that stigma word again. So some did report that there is stigma related to seeking peer support and a culture that really makes people reluctant to ask for help, makes them reluctant to seek help. And I think it's stigma. I think in some instances there may be concerned about, is this information being shared in any way? Does this become part of my evaluation? Will my supervisor know? Is there any documentation kept? I think for some that is present, but I think it's just kind of this bigger thing too of it's not okay to need to or want to talk to someone and take care of myself. And then some commented that there's a need for a more formal selection process and an ongoing support for peers. So it can't be just an initial training. There's just a need there for that kind of ongoing support, and also acknowledgement there can be turnover in people who serve in these roles. It can be stressful to serve in these roles. So thinking through growing your group of individuals who serve in these roles and creating an opportunity to rotate on and off for those that want that, as opposed to it being a passion project for the first group of people who may start this out. When we looked at underutilization and what could be done, so an interest in maybe just marketing and promoting more that this is available, and agency leaders and supervisors talking about it more. Some mentioned incentives for participation. And then I think, there also is for some wanting to be acknowledged that some may prefer to work with somebody outside of the agency and making that okay as well. So not making it the only path to seek help, but a path. We were curious if people were keeping data on how they were doing around evaluating staff wellness. I think a lot about Chris always asks this question. She's a data girl, and so I love this question. So only 9% of participants report that their agency maintains any kind of aggregate data on the use of programs that address primary and secondary trauma and wellness. We know it's important to measure things. We measure things with our supervisees. We need to measure how we're doing in this. So one of the ways people do it are climate surveys, meaning, sign up these annual surveys or biannual surveys that check in with all of the individuals working within an agency, from line officers to middle management to the individuals who check in people at the front desk to leadership, asking a lot of questions about what's going on in the agency and how people are feeling about things. Only 27% said that this is something that their agency does to monitor staff well-being. And of those where they do use a climate survey, 46% report that the information is used by management to adjust the availability of resources. That's the perfect world. Use this information to better direct your resources and better reach your people. And 15% reported that it's used by everyone, not just management, like everyone uses the information to adjust the resources. So that is your quick walkthrough of what we learned from the respondents. If you happen to be one of the individuals who took our survey, I want to personally thank you for the time and attention that you spent on this. So Chris, I'm going to hand things back over to you.
Absolutely. So the last area we explored with the respondents was asking them what training and technical assistance needs they felt like their agency had needs. And we asked them on a scale of strongly needed, somewhat needed, not needed, no opinion. And what we pulled out for you here was the strongly needed area. So if we look at anything that's 50% or above, most of those, 4 of those 5 areas all say training. So 65, almost 66% said training for supervisors, the middle managers, which we often forget and really are the main source of support for our frontline officers. Almost 64% said training for frontline officers. So I would see that as that resiliency that we've been talking about. 58, almost 59% said model curriculum related to responding to stress and secondary trauma. So making it easier for the field, let's go ahead and provide them curriculum. And that already begins to address this and helps agencies begin to work in this area. 55% said train the trainers. So let's go ahead and provide the resources within the agencies so they're able to sustain this long term. 52% said training for directors and chiefs. Not surprising, but that certainly gives us a little bit of forecast of where maybe we should be going, in at least what the respondents as part of this survey felt like where we should be heading. We did have some open text questions and wanted to share what we heard when we asked about training and technical needs, when specifically related to critical response teams. We heard in the area of training that crisis intervention training for staff was needed, that there needed to be formal training on how to develop the critical incident response program, that from a human resource perspective, that there needed to be outside professionals to provide that support to the team, and there needed to be more information-based resources. So resources around peer support, doing the peer-to-peer exchange, resources on responding to and managing agency-level trauma, additional ways to support family members. Don't want to forget that, particularly when you're talking about a very traumatic experience that is often going to be brought home into the home. And then lastly, the opportunities to exchange information and ideas with other agencies, whether they're law enforcement focused or just related to our field. In the area of peer support programs, training and technical assistance needs that were noted, training specifically, ongoing webinars and online training. We certainly have learned over the last 18 months that we can be pretty effective with online trainings. So that actually does open up a whole nother area for us to work in. Having hands-on interactive training specific to peer support, on-call suicide response training, CISM system training for additional staff members. So just, again, spreading out that training. The information-based resources, a dedicated training curriculum or handbook, especially with materials specific to community supervision. That is on point. Resources to keep you up on current and emerging best practices, and resources to promote the importance of peer support and wellness among supervisors and leadership. So we're kind of seeing these kind of round out some of the things we've talked about. Stigma, having model curriculum, all those things already being available. And then lastly, training needs in the area of employee wellness programs. We want to see programs that address mental health, coping skills, stress relief training, training focused on burnout and compassion fatigue, formal crisis training, interactive training, and then training on assessing EAP services. So we're investing money in EAP services. How are they serving our constituents, our officers, our workforce in a manner that is useful to them? So summary and wrap up, Tara, I'm going to throw out just a couple of summary statements on my side and then invite you to do the same. I think what I have learned so far, because this is an ever evolving process, we continue to learn from each other. We continue to learn from other disciplines. So that's something that's still building. But I really do believe that the industry we've chosen to work in, it's stressful. Inevitably, it's stressful. A lot of things we've been talking about and pointing to, we can't necessarily change those circumstances. What we can change, and the area we do need to work in, is how we respond to them. So what is the resiliency factor or measure for the officers we have in place and for officers we may be looking at hiring in the future? How does our organization line up if we're thinking about resiliency as an organization? What do I have control over, and what can I begin to change now? How can I start impacting that? I think some of us come to the job better prepared, which starts us off in a good place, but you can wear that thin if we do not have things in place that continue to help that thought process and that approach to life and that perspective to continue. Some of us come to the job with less of those resiliency factors, less of those protective factors. That's the word we use with clients, less of those protective factors. And if you're in a leadership position, you have some responsibility to begin to build up that. Again, it's going to serve your organization in the long term because you're going to reduce things like burnout, compassion fatigue, your turnover rates. You're going to have individuals who work for you who recognize that you care for them and value them. And sometimes that is much more important than even the paycheck that they are receiving. When I think about what's next to me, there's some areas that I'm particularly curious about at this point. I want to know what trainings, when we talk about model curriculum, I want to know what can have the right impact. When we talk about resiliency, what specific kind of curriculum could be brought into agencies that helps do that? How often should it happen? Should it happen up front? Is there a particular kind of employee we should be looking for? These are the areas that I hope we get to delve into in the future. Thank you for having me today. Tara, I will let you finish.
Thanks, Chris. So I echo everything you just said. So at the beginning, we talked about our work with NIC and our deliverable, which is a white paper. And one of the exciting things is that we get to end our white paper with a set of recommendations and a roadmap for future work. We do anticipate this will go into a second year of work. In terms of what I am excited about that I know will show up in the recommendations is taking all of those needs that the survey respondents expressed around needing training. That is, in my mind, kind of an easy investment. We need to make it easier to implement strategies, which means we need to set up some guidelines. We need to be articulating some best practices. If we don't know what they are, we need to be investing in research. So we get a better handle on what really moves the needle on resiliency, what really resonates with community supervision officers. So I'm excited to think a lot about standardization of training. I'm excited to think a lot about implementation strategies. I love peer-to-peer exchanges. It excites me to think about taking agencies that are doing good work in the field and really making that more available to others to replicate. And so I think you'll see some of that in our white paper, which I know will eventually be made public. There's always a long government process to get things out, but I know it will eventually be making its way out into the field. So all of that is on my mind. And this is ongoing work for both Chris and I. So I do want to share our contact information. If you have something going on within your agency, a strategy, a model program, a curriculum, anything that you would like to share with us, we want to hear from you. So I hope you'll take our contact information. I hope you'll reach out. I know, when we're in conference venues, we tend to exchange cards. This is our way now to convey that. And if any of you also are happen to be in person at APPA, I know Chris is going to be there. So find her in the crowd or reach out and try to connect with her there. So I also want to thank you for your time and attention, and thank you.